Good afternoon. My name is Cinthya Rodriguez. I'm here joining y'all from Chicago. So first, again, I'm a national organizer with Mijente. Mijente is an organization that was founded in 2015. Mijente is both a political home and an organizing hub, particularly for Latino and Chicano people all across the United States and in Puerto Rico. And so we're both a political home and an organizing hub. And by that, we mean one, we're a space for folks to come together that share our values around racial justice, climate justice, migrant justice, right? So on and so forth, that identify as Latino or Chicano, and that really believe that in this moment, and particularly when we were founded in 2015, making the assessment that it's not necessarily need more of us, but we need more from us. And so what does that mean? And so Mijente is a political home and also an organizing hub. And as an organizing hub, we mean when we say more of us, we really mean we need more organizing. We're an organization that really believes in the power of organizing to make change, and that we need a space and that we need to come together to sharpen our skills, our analysis, to make change for our communities. And so we're really informed in particular by the framework of Sin Contra Desde, which comes from grassroots social movements in Chile, particularly El Movimiento de Pobladores en Lucha, who talk about organizing sin contra and desde el Estado. And so we do believe that we need to be fighting at all levels for our communities, and that means organizing without, against, and sometimes within the state in order to win the resources and the changes that we need for our communities, and not just for Latino and Chicano communities, but for everyone. And so within that framework falls the No Tech for ICE campaign that began in 2018. Very much a contra campaign, right? We created the campaign, we founded No Tech to ICE to really ring the alarm about how tech companies, how big tech, how big data was creating the tools for detentions and deportations. And so No Tech for ICE was created to ring the alarm in order to, one, share information about and develop an analysis around what this looks like, and two, to make more space for organizing, particularly organizing, again, not just against ICE, but in particular against these big tech companies and corporations that are creating these tools. Because the campaign really comes from hearing from community, from hearing from our communities, from hearing from, and by that I mean by our own members, right? Because Mijente is also a membership organization, hearing from our partner organizations, and starting to form these patterns. And so we were hearing all across the country people saying, something's happening, something's changing in the way that immigration enforcement is enacting enforcement. And we're just not sure how to name it. But what we're hearing and what we're seeing is, for example, people would say things like, well, I don't know how immigration enforcement here in the US knew that my cousin worked at this company and then showed up. I don't understand how ICE, immigration enforcement, knew that my neighbor lived next door and then showed up and raided their house. I don't know how immigration enforcement knew that this person, my cousin, my brother, my neighbor, etc., was driving this car and then pulled them over while they were on their way, to pick up their children from school. And so the question was, we know, so, at that point we're like, well, we've known for years that information is being shared, but how exactly is that happening was really what gave way to forming No Tech for ICE. We were really seeing that ICE was changing how they carried out enforcement, and we needed to figure out what that looked like, right? And so we started with a lot of research, and I'll share links at the end, but folks can read our first report that we put out, Who's Behind ICE, where we started to really dig into what's the tech and data that's supercharging ICE. And so really with the No Tech for ICE campaign, we've done the work of, one, figuring out how do we reduce harm? How do we reduce the harm that ICE, that immigration enforcement, is causing to our communities by using tech and data in this way? to target individuals and communities, but also two, how do we develop a deeper understanding of the actual technology that is being used? And so I'll also say, and we always say this, that, as an organization, we're not tech experts, and who make part of the campaign are former tech workers or tech experts. But, what we have done is really try to figure out what's the information that our community needs. How can we figure out what's happening behind closed doors, and what can we expose, and then how can we take action, and work for strong protections for our community. And so in all of this, what we found, over the last, now since 2018, over the last 5 years, is that so much has happened. I think when the campaign started, at least particularly like in movement space, people weren't talking about this very much. And so more and more, people are talking more and more about what tech and data is powering immigration enforcement, but just enforcement and surveillance in general. And with that as well, we've seen, more language around just like data and tech enter the mainstream. So as that continues to happen, we're just also seeing that from the role of ICE, from immigration enforcement, as all of that happened in the last couple of years, they've also grown and casted a wider and wider net around our information, around personal information, casted a wider and wider net by pursuing more contracts, more technology. And so, we continue the No Tech for ICE campaign. We continue to go after, the ways in which ICE and these corporations are working together against our communities. And so, the campaign continues. And I want to share a little bit more of how we got here and then where we're at now. So just wanted to share some pictures so folks could put a little bit more of some faces to who we are. This is some of the team. Not all of us. And as I shared, we're a little bit spread out throughout the country. I'm in Chicago. There's some more folks in Chicago, but we're spread out. Again, Mijente, we're a political home organizing hub. And we have our roots as an organization. And the reason why we do the No Tech for ICE campaign is because we've been doing work for a long time, both as Mijente officially, but also as the organizations and the people that came together to form Mijente. We've been doing work for a very long time now to organize against immigration enforcement and for our communities. And so I wanted to just kind of take it a little bit of a step back in terms of how did we get to where we are today, and how did we develop the campaign? How did we develop No Tech for ICE? And so when I talk about the campaign, or when we talk about the campaign, a lot of the times we talk about, as I mentioned, immigration enforcement is casting a wider and wider net through technology, through data. And so for us, we'll often use this idea of like, what is this octopus that we're organizing against that has many tentacles of reaching into our communities, but also many tentacles that we can go after in our organizing. Just to take it a little bit of a step back of like, how did we get here? So I'll also share that Mijente last year in winter and spring ran a course called Tech Wars. So this is pulled out of that presentation. You'll see we have if folks want to share a very memorable person from Star Wars that has been compared to the other individual in this picture. So last year, Mijente launched Tech Wars, a 5-part online course where we talked about all of this, where we talked about digital surveillance. We had many professors and movement leaders and organizers join us to talk about how they're organizing against digital surveillance, and to talk about the different kinds of analysis that inform the campaign and the work that folks are doing. So just wanted to give a little plug there for folks if people want to hear more, if people are interested in learning more about how Mijente has engaged with all of this, you can definitely check out Tech Wars 5-part course. It's up online on our education platform called El Instituto, and I'll share that with folks later, but just wanted to put that plug in there. And also another plug is that we're actually launching our first international course next month, or actually this month. It's already May. So at the end of the month, we're gonna have actually a 4-course program for folks that are interested. It'll be in English and Spanish. We're partnering up with La Universidad de Recoleta, the UAR in Chile, to offer an international diploma in data democracy, in data surveillance and democracy for folks that are interested. But to bring it back to the giant octopus of immigrant digital surveillance, we can go back to kind of this moment here, which is really the creation, the founding of the Department of Homeland Security. And, it's important to name this moment when we talk about the campaign for No Tech for ICE, because we know that the kind of investment and the kind of a focus on using tech and data to carry out enforcement, is rooted in a big way in this moment in the founding of the Department of Homeland Security, when you have this agency explicitly created to identify, to surveil, to detain, and to deport all undocumented people. And that's its explicit mission. And so what happens, right? DHS is founded with this mission to target everyone who is undocumented in the US. Folks quickly find that ICE actually isn't able to carry out that mission, right? They don't have the resources, the people to do that to its entirety. And so I wanted to share with folks that this is really when we start to see the rise of programs where ICE is like, well, who am I going to work with, right? Immigration enforcement in the US is like, who am I going to work with? Who am I going to partner with to be able to carry out this mission? Because with the agents that we have, with the information that we have, it's just not enough. And so ICE, again, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, starts to partner with local police departments all across the US, enters into agreements with prisons throughout the US, and we talk about this as ICE's 287G program, secure community programs, where local police is all of a sudden executing immigration enforcement. Fingerprints are being taken by local enforcement information, and data is being shared. And that's to support, right, the ICE agents that can't do this work on their own. And so that's happening. And again, Mijente has been doing organizing, the organizations and the people that have come together to form Mijente in the last 8 years, during the moment of the height of 287G agreements and secure communities, are organizing against it, are calling attention to what it means, to how it criminalizes immigrants and how we fight back. And then as the years pass by, all of a sudden you have someone else enter the scene whose picture I didn't, put on here, but then you have Trump enter the scene. And what does Trump bring? He brings extra connections and extra friendships with big tech, with big data. And I'm sharing this not to say that the reason why we have the kind of digital surveillance by immigration enforcement that we do today is because Trump is friends with big tech and big data companies. Not at all, but it does add another layer of the kind of pivot that immigration enforcement does when they're like, okay, we thought that we would just be able to use local police and local prisons to multiply our work. Well, we tried that, and actually community has been fighting back. Organizations like Mijente, but so many other organizations locally and nationally, said, not without a fight. And so all of a sudden, you see just huge fights all across the country, right, around what does it mean to create sanctuary protections, welcoming protections, protections in local jurisdictions that actually limit information sharing between ICE and local enforcement, that actually prohibit the use or the cooperation of local law enforcement with immigration enforcement. And so, at this point, ICE has lost a lot of territory in that way, because local organizing was working and making wins and winning protections for community. With big tech and big data, right? You just start to see a couple of things happen. One, right? I know this gets thrown around so much, and it's a lot, it's a lot more nuanced. But when No Tech or ICE was founded, we did start talking about, well, what does it mean to hold that data? It's the new oil, the new gold, and that it's being used by immigration enforcement. What does it mean that there's actually a lot of profit in data sharing? So when local organizers, organizations, campaigns are winning and cutting off some of that data sharing between ICE and local companies, what money is there for, or between ICE and local jurisdictions, what money is actually there for some of these companies to come in and start to enact third party and to really lean into third party data sharing, amongst other kinds of technologies. So that's what we're starting to look at, and that's what we're trying to piece through. And so with that, I kind of want to spend the next 10 or so minutes taking folks through how we've really thought about the different kinds of technology that ICE uses in 4 different buckets. And some of this is probably stuff that folks already know. But, I just wanted to take folks through this next piece around, all right, this is how we saw ICE, immigration enforcement in the US rely more and more on data, start to rely more and more on data and technology. Well, what were those big areas of technology looking like, and how has that informed how we've decided to organize and the kinds of public actions that we've taken and the work that we continue to do. So with that, I want to take folks through what we talk about as kind of the 4 different buckets of technology that ICE uses to, again, try to fulfill its mission of surveillance, of detaining and deporting undocumented people. And so to go through these 4 buckets, the first one is the bucket of data broker companies, right? And so folks remember, the No Tech for ICE campaign coming out of people being like, how is my address? How is my neighbor's car information? How is my cousin's workplace information falling into the hands of ICE? And so the first place that Mijente looked at was, how do we understand the relationship between data broker companies and immigration enforcement? And so when we talk about data broker companies, right, we're talking about companies that are selling commercial, public, private information, everything from your phone bill to medical history to where our kids go to school to what you put up on social media. And, when we started talking about data broker companies with our members and with communities, we would say, these data broker companies, they target you to sell you things, whether it's to figure out who they can best sell a blender to. But, what does it mean when that information is actually being used to target you or other community members for the purposes of detaining or deporting you? And so that information being information, again, like license plate data, utility bill info, criminal record info, and what we put up on social media. So these are 4 examples that we talk about when we talk about how data brokers collaborate with ICE, and let me go through them a little bit piece by piece. So first, and again, we got some cameos here from some Star Wars characters because we use some of this in our Tech Wars course. But driver's license data is some of the information that companies like Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis, 2 of the biggest data brokers in the world, are using and have, and that is shared with ICE. And so there's actually been a lot of campaigns that have fought to make driver's licenses available to folks that are undocumented. And that's, been an organizing fight, and people have made big wins there. But one of the things that has come out of that as well is figuring out that, actually, what are some of the loopholes that still exist there, especially when we're creating this kind of a license for folks that don't have status. What are the dangers of some of that information falling into the hands of ICE? And so those are some of the organizing that continues, particularly in places that have won driver's licenses, that have campaigns like Driver's Licenses for All. Here in Illinois, where I live, we have TVDLs, temporary driver's licenses. And so, folks are continuing to figure out, how do we close those loopholes to make sure that that information is not falling directly on a silver platter into the hands of ICE. Utility bill info, criminal record info. So with utility bills, another big piece of information that, another big document, that has information, all kinds of information about us, that falls into the hands of data brokers, that can fall into the hands of immigration enforcement. There was a big fight, or rather say a big win, about a little bit over a year ago. Again, there's a lot of people that are thinking about this, that are thinking about what can we do here. And so Mijente actually partnered up with Senator Wyden, who pressured and put pressure to make sure that utility bill companies were cutting off some of the information that they were sharing, that they were collecting, and then that was getting into the hands of ICE. So we've made some inroads around utility bill info. When it comes to criminal record info, what we're seeing is that data brokers collect not only commercial, public, private information, but they're also able to collect real-time incarceration data. And so, there's ways in which information from jails, from prisons is public, but what we're seeing is that actually, there's a way in which data broker companies, and in their contracts with ICE, are able to give real-time release information to ICE. And so in cities like Chicago here in the US, where you have, quote unquote, sanctuary protections that are supposed to prohibit the release of individuals into the hands of ICE when they're released from jail, you see that at the click of a button, ICE can actually access that information on their own when someone is released. And so all of this license plate data, utility info, real-time incarceration data, has been falling into the hands of ICE. And so that's the first big bucket of technology and data that we talk about. In terms of how ICE is using technology and data, we talk about data broker companies, just the collection, the accumulation of data, entering into contracts to be able to access that data. And we talk about big companies here like LexisNexis, like Thomson Reuters, but then also through like utility bill company or utility info companies, utility bill info that gets into the hands of big credit reporting agencies like Experian. And so in particular, Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis are two corporations that Mijente has made a lot of noise about. And that's in great part, I should say, because of the work of, in particular, law students, librarians, other academics that have really, really come to say publicly, a company like Thomson Reuters, a company like LexisNexis, really well known for like their publishing, for the work that they do in publishing, or the work that they do to provide academic tools, research tools, but actually, they're making a great amount of profit from entering into contracts with immigration enforcement, and that shouldn't be happening. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but a lot of organizing has happened against these corporations, or to call attention to these corporations and these kinds of contracts that they're entering into, in particular by law students and librarians all across the country, and also by shareholders in Canada, which I'll get to later. But that's the first bucket, is data broker companies. The next bucket is data analytics. So, again, if folks already know this information, just kind of sharing it from the perspective of like how we've incorporated it into our campaign. But all right, you have the data, you've accumulated all this information about individuals, but if it's just kind of existing out there in the world, there's not much you can do with it until you analyze it. And so that's the second bucket, is the bucket of data analytics, the need to have software that processes all of this information, that gives it meaning and puts it into the hands of ICE as like, here's the list of people that you're going to go after, or here's kind of like the Facebook of law enforcement for you to see how individuals have connections in their community or to other people, and to make profiles of people that then can be used to enact enforcement. And so when it comes to the second bucket, the bucket of data analytics, we talk a lot about Palantir. For folks that are familiar with Palantir, this is a company that when we started the campaign was like a company that everyone wanted to go work for. And when we were starting the campaign and what was happening in the world, what was happening in the US around immigration enforcement were a couple of things. One was, and a big one was, that one of the largest raids, if not the largest raid in US history, had just happened. And that was the poultry raids that happened in Mississippi. And so, when we were responding to that and working with folks that were on the ground, responding to that massive, massive raid, we actually found that Palantir was a big name behind that actual raid taking place. And so Palantir has contracts with immigration enforcement. In fact, they've been called at one point mission critical, a company that has software that's mission critical to ICE. And so in those poultry raids, we saw the use of two of their big pieces of software that they contract with ICE with. And that's one, a tool called Falcon that has a tip line. And so that was a tip line that officers were using during the raids. And then ICM, which is basically like their database that holds, how the data is being processed. And so in the context of all of that, we were like, you know what? Every party needs a piñata. Every party needs a piñata. And so Palantir became the piñata for No Tech for ICE when the campaign got started, to be like, look at what they're doing. Everyone wants to go work for them. They're opening up, trying to open up a headquarters in Colorado, but they've done all this stuff that you should know about. And so we started to campaign and to raise awareness around what Palantir is doing. When they tried to open up their headquarters in Colorado, working with local organizers, we actually threw an unwelcome party for them. And so Palantir continues to have contracts with the government, with ICE. Not as much as they did before. They definitely took quite, definitely faced a lot of pressure from folks. But in that moment, we were really focusing on organizing against Palantir. And then I would say now, just how we've seen ICE rely more and more on accumulating more and more data. We really focused on this work that we're doing against data broker companies, but over the years, that's, how we've interpreted the different buckets. So one, data broker companies, the accumulation of our data. Two, data analytics, the processing, giving meaning to that data. And then, going back to the octopus, the octopus has a lot of tentacles. And one of those other And in order for that octopus to exist, it has to sit somewhere. It has to live somewhere. And so the third bucket that we talk about in terms of how ICE uses technology is how ICE holds and saves all of that information that it's collecting, that it's processing, and that's through the cloud. And so the fourth bucket is cloud software. And there enters Amazon. And so when we talk about cloud software used by immigration enforcement, we're talking a lot about Amazon. You know, folks probably know Amazon holds a lot of the immigration enforcement information software contracts. They hold a lot of other contracts in terms of the use of Amazon Web Services for their cloud to store information. They've had lobbyists, you know, go very heavy in DC to make sure that they can secure these contracts and that the laws are written to, you know, be able to do this. But what I just want to share briefly is that when we were looking into this and understanding, you know, the role of Amazon, the role of the cloud with immigration enforcement, ICE was, you know, these companies just keep trying to open headquarters after headquarters, and we keep going after them. And so Amazon was trying to open up a headquarters in New York. And so we were sharing with folks what Amazon was doing and how Amazon was collaborating with immigration enforcement, the kinds of contracts that they had, those ties. And at the same time, you know, other organizations are working on not wanting, you know, wanting to kick Amazon out of New York, whether it was because of workers' rights or because of the fight for housing, or, you know, just because Amazon's not paying taxes. And so all of these different groups came together. We formed a coalition in New York to stop them from opening up their headquarters there. And all of this just really comes to, again, to show that, like, as the octopus of digital surveillance on behalf of ICE continues to grow and grow, our movement, our coalitions, our organizing has to grow as well. And so that takes me then to the last bucket of how we talk about immigration enforcement collaboration with technology, and that's the bucket of biometrics, biometric data. So we're talking about, right, information about how we move, about how we talk, about what we look like, information about our person. And so we see ICE use technology to do voice recognition, to scan irises, to collect our DNA, facial recognition. So all of that biometric data is something that ICE is building up. And as a side note, one of the reports that came out last year that we worked on with other organizations, in particular our partners at Just Futures Law, you know, we talk about this new database that ICE has been funding called the HEART database, biometric database, if folks, you know, want to learn more about that. But with biometric data and the increase in the use of biometric data and biometric technology by ICE, we're talking about all those things, again, voice recognition, DNA, eye scans, but we're also talking about fingerprinting. We're also talking about ankle shackles. And so what I wanted to share just in terms of this side of the technology is two things, really. One is, like, who are these companies? And then two is what's the narrative that's being told? So when we talk about the companies here, in particular, like around the ankle shackles, but also now there's phone applications that are used for folks to have to check in with their ICE officer, where they have to, like, literally, you know, take a picture of their face and upload it into an application. You know, this is technology that's being run by a company called BI Incorporated, a subsidiary of GEO Group. So we're talking again about some of the same companies that we know in the larger fight against prisons, against enforcement, against policing. But here we have BI Incorporated under GEO Group running a huge program that people talk about as an alternative to detention, which, I'll break down in a sec, but, people are talking about ankle shackles and this smartphone application as an alternative to detention. And this is a program, and people that are forced into this program, are being forced into ankle shackles, forced to check in through their phone. And this program has been growing, and increasing by a lot, particularly in the last couple of years. A year ago, we did a town hall with a few different Congress people to bring attention to the increase in enrollment in this program by ICE and the kind of increased reliance in this program. And at that point, the number of people enrolled was just over 200,000. And now going into, where we're at in 2023, over 300,000 people are enrolled in this program that is being talked about as an alternative to detention, where, the narrative is, well, people aren't being kept in a cage anymore. People are free to move. People still have this ankle shackle on, or they have to check in on their phone, but it's a safer, it's a more gentle way of surveilling people. And so that's the narrative that ICE, the immigration enforcement in the US, has been putting out about the use of these kinds of technologies. And so our work has really been to say, no, the only real alternative to detention is freedom, is liberation. And there's just all sorts of problems just with the use of this technology itself. But we cannot allow ourselves to reach a point where, now we're talking about gentler, safer ways of policing people. That's also the way that, technology being deployed for surveillance at the border is being talked about. When there's this talk about a digital wall at the border, at the US-Mexico border, in particular, right, there's this talk of, well, we have a digital wall now. We're putting all of our money in a digital wall into biometric surveillance at the border. And that's safer and more gentle. And that's an alternative to the physical wall. Again, ankle shackles and the smartphone app as an alternative to physical detention. But we know that we still have a lot of work to do, that the only real alternative to detention is our folks' freedom, is our folks' liberation from the surveillance. And so, we've been working with organizations all across the US to continue to monitor how these programs are developing, how they continue to increase enrollment. And we're monitoring, how ICE continues to talk about them, because, we know that, again, these are not alternatives. In fact, there's a lot of money in using these technologies and increasing their use. And it's just incredibly hard for people to be able to get out of these programs. And they have incredible effects on people's livelihoods, people's mobility, all kinds of medical issues. So if folks are interested in kind of reading more about that, if folks want to learn more, we put out a report last year around this as well. But I think what's really important about that report in particular, and it's called Tracked, Not Trapped, and it's actually available in multiple languages. I want to say it's in French too, Spanish, English, and then I'm forgetting what other translations we have, but it's called Tracked and Trapped, and it's on our website. And the report features testimonies from 10 people all across the US who are on these programs, and they share their story. All right, so that's how over the years, Mijente has understood the different kinds of tech and data that ICE is using to surveil, to deport, to detain our community members. And we know that there's more. This is just, to share what are some of the technologies and companies that we've been organizing around. But the No Tech for ICE campaign is a campaign that we talk about as like, it's an open source campaign. Mijente is a larger organization. No Tech for ICE is one piece of the larger work that we do. And so we really want people to just like continue to run with it. After No Tech for ICE, we got to see people also even just run with the hashtag, right? There's No Tech for Apartheid, amongst others, No Tech for Tyrants. And so for us, it's really about like, here's the information, here's reports, here's toolkits that folks can access if they want to understand what it looks like for ICE to be contracting with big tech and big data in their own communities. And so just wanted to kind of highlight some of the groups that we've done that work with. And sorry, this is so tiny, but we've worked with, as I said, law students and librarians who really called out locally in their schools, have talked to their deans, have talked to other students, have talked to other librarians about, what does it mean that this research tool that we use, that this company that runs these research tools that we use is actually using information to harm immigrant communities. And so we've supported law students. There's a law student coalition called the End the Contracts Coalition that has weeks of action every year that's been targeting, both the use of LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters, particularly LexisNexis on their campuses, but that has also called out these companies. So actually just a little bit over a month ago, 15 plus law schools had their week of action. And in New York, students from some of the different law schools came together and did a protest in front of the LexisNexis headquarters. And all of that is really important. Like there's, Mijente has tried to reach out to some of these companies multiple times. LexisNexis never responded to us, but when they saw students, stirring things up and bringing more people into the fold, LexisNexis actually sent them a letter, a public letter. Last year, over the summer, librarians at both the American Library Association conference and also the Law Librarian or the Law Library Association conference in DC and Colorado, respectively, librarians attended both of those conferences and did actions and tabling to talk to other librarians and other law folks in the law field about what it means that these contracts exist and to call them out and to call for an end to these contracts. We've worked with shareholders. So we've worked over the years actually with the BCGU in Canada that has filed shareholder resolutions calling on Thomson Reuters to have to run a human rights assessment into their contracts with ICE. And so actually last year, Thomson Reuters did respond to that shareholder resolution and they did a human rights assessment. And obviously, we were always very cautionary about it. And so we've been waiting for the next steps around that. But, shareholders, investors have a very important place in this work as well to call attention to the funding, to the money that's going, the investment that's going into these companies that are doing all of this to our communities. And so we worked with immigrant organizers, with folks that are doing work against policing, with folks that are challenging the military-industrial complex, with tech workers themselves, because we need everyone at every level thinking about what are the connections to the ways in which ICE is using tech and data, and what can our role be in that larger fight to take down this bigger octopus. And so here's some pictures. These are some of the students tabling and putting up banners at their school. If folks know any law students or librarians that want to get involved, we're always happy to support and talk through folks, talk to folks through some of that. And this is a picture from when we worked with a group of tech workers to put up a huge giant cage at Burning Man, to call attention to all of this as well. And so, we've done and tried different things, and we're always down to collaborate with folks who want to, think about what organizing against big tech and data collusion with ICE looks like, or could look like. And then, we've been trying out, now that the campaign's been around for a few years, we've really wanted to be able to share the lessons learned, and how we've gotten to this place. And so, when I did my pitch earlier for Tech Wars, this is the flow of the Tech Wars course that we hosted last year. 5 sessions with a lot of Star Wars references, to put that out there. But yeah, so just to kind of like start to bring things together, to wrap up, one, No Tech for ICE. We've been around since 2018. This is how we've understood, and how we've organized from our research and understanding of the different kinds of technology that ICE is using. We've worked with a lot of, this is work that we do not do alone. This is work that needs to happen with others. And so we've worked with a lot of different organizations, groups, people, communities, to try to take down some of the tentacles of what we also call is the ICE digital dragnet. And we've been putting out some of that into educational materials, both toolkits and reports that you can find on our website, this course, and also the new course that we're about to launch with the UAR in Chile, which I should mention is actually really cool because it's a people's university. It's a university that was founded out of the work of grassroots movements in Chile. So it's actually a public university, a people's university, a pluriversity, they call it. And so we're launching that in Spanish on May 25th and in English on June 25th. The first course is on the data economy, but then we'll have a second course focusing on misinformation, a third course focusing on surveillance, and then a fourth course that we'll talk about just kind of new technologies that we're seeing. So that's all on the horizon. But I really wanted to share with folks that we have tools that we share. If folks want to use them, please check out our website. And then, a couple of things that, we're cooking up a couple of different things right now. One of the things that I'll mention is, and kind of referencing back to when I was talking about, well, now we have these cities, particularly in blue cities like Chicago, where community organizations have fought really hard for there to be a limit on information that's shared between ICE and local government. And, a lot of territory has been won there. Here in Cook County, which is the county where Chicago sits, the city of Chicago, there's a prohibition on detainers, which means that, as I was sharing earlier, ICE cannot transfer people, or local police cannot transfer people into ICE custody. But, from our research, we've seen that, well, there's still real-time incarceration data that's shared. There's still like this whole other web of personal information that falls into the hands of ICE. And so what can we do at the local government level to put a stop to that, to put limits on that? And so in the last year, we've been working with local government here in Cook County in the Chicago area to pass the first resolution, or the first ordinance of its kind that would actually close those data loopholes, that would close third-party information sharing with ICE on behalf of the county. And so we're about to introduce that policy. We haven't gone public about it yet, but we're about to introduce that policy this month. And we actually are also supporting some folks in LA that are thinking about something very similar. But that's where we're at, is figuring out what are some new models for policy that we can win, that other folks can learn from in other parts of the US. But I'll stop there. But I'm happy to talk more about any piece in particular, or answer any questions, or talk more about the work that we have coming up. But I also wanted to leave folks with, you can scan the QR code here that's on the screen, and it'll take you to our website, and to some of our resources. But yeah, I'll hand it back to folks that are in person, and just let me know what I can dig into a little bit deeper, or any questions that folks have.